this is Esther with Discover Your Origins, and I wanted to share some research I've done on Duncan Stewart. Duncan Stewart was born supposedly the 1st of March, 1815 in Tennessee, but he primarily lived in Lauderdale County, Alabama. He's the son of James Duncan Stewart, who immigrated from Scotland and died February of 1849 in Lauderdale County, Alabama. Two of Duncan Stewart's descendants, Helen Chambers and Granville Allen, did some research, and they tell the story that Duncan Stewart fathered two children with Elizabeth Pelt. He left for California Gold Rush and then returned and died eventually and was buried on Opossum Creek north of Highway 64. There was no evidence of a marriage between Elizabeth Pelt and Duncan Stewart, and the two children of Elizabeth are attributed to him because they had red hair, and Duncan Stewart had red hair. Elizabeth was married to Merrill Love during this time, so it was kind of a scandalous situation because Duncan and Elizabeth were having an affair. The two children were raised supposedly by Merrill Love, but we're not really sure. He disappears, and the children are found living with their grandmother, Sarah Essery Pelt, in 1860. So the big question about Duncan Stewart is, did he go to California during the California Gold Rush? And could he have traveled to California and back in time to have fathered those children? So the reason this question came up is because I looked at some source records for somebody else, and the record collection I was looking at was the Road Book of Lauderdale County, Alabama, 1844 to 1861. This is kind of a boring record collection because it's just a list of men who maintain the roads in Alabama, in Lauderdale County specifically. And Duncan Stewart identifies himself as a road worker or overseer in the census. And so while I was looking for somebody else, I kept running across Duncan Stewart. So this page is an example of what this record collection looks like. And you can see Duncan Stewart here, and he's working on the Old Pulaski Road, and the section he was assigned was Danley's to Stewart's Branch. And I'm assuming Stewart's Branch is probably where the Stewart property was. And this page is from 1850, and so I can definitely place Duncan Stewart in Lauderdale County in 1850. So there's a 3-year gap. So let me go back and look at the sources attached to Duncan Stewart. And here I've assigned a year to each of these pages that I found in the road book for Duncan Stewart. So you can see him in the 1830 census, and then he's in Alabama in 1849, 1850. There's approximately a 2-year gap here. I know it looks like 3, but I'll explain, where we don't know where Duncan is. But then after that, we know that he's there consistently. 1854, 56, 57, 58, all the way through. And then, of course, he's there for the Alabama State Census in 1866. So he's consistently in Lauderdale County in the 1850s and 1860s. So I did a little bit more research, and I wanted to find out if Duncan Stewart could have traveled and come back from California to Alabama. So the California Gold Rush began in 1848 when gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California. And that started the whole influx of people coming in. Originally, it was people who were local to the area, and then it kind of spread out to the entire United States and then the whole world. The primary influx of people was in 1849, and there was still some coming in after that in 1850 and so on, but it started to trickle off and drop pretty quickly. But they estimate there were about 300,000 people that traveled to California during the gold rush, and they took 2 possible routes. One was the California Trail, and then the other was the southern route on the Gila River Trail. So I asked this question, and could a man have traveled to California in 1849 in a reasonable amount of time? How long would that have taken? And would he have been able to come back in that amount of time? So I figured that the journey from St. Louis, Missouri to Coloma, California was about 2,457 miles if he took the northern route, which most likely he would have, because that was an established known route and he probably would have traveled with other people. And if he were to have traveled by horse alone, how long would it have taken him? And a professor of history at New York University estimated that travel by horse, at most, you could have traveled 50 miles a day. And it would have taken 48 days of continual riding to do 2,400 miles. But because it was 1849, you have to realize that it's primitive trails. And so, you'd have to add extra time. You'd have to take time to stop and rest. And so I figure realistically, it would have taken about 3 months. So 3 months to travel to California, 3 months to travel back. And of course, he would have stayed if he traveled there for a while to see if he could have found gold. And he may have stayed until his money ran out. Who knows? So he realistically probably was there at least a year. But he wouldn't have traveled in the winter. That would have been impossible. So he could have only traveled spring and summer, maybe early fall. Because, we're talking about partially going through the Rocky Mountains. And so, your ability to travel through there would have been limited by the seasons. He most likely, if he did travel, didn't travel by horse alone. He would have probably traveled by wagon because he would need supplies, and he would have traveled with a group. And a group traveling by wagon would have taken longer, and most likely 4 to 6 months. So, we're looking at a year and a half minimum that he would have had to be gone. So a year traveling and then coming back. Okay, so here I have kind of a timeline where I break it down a little bit based on records. And what I determined is that it is possible that Duncan could have traveled to California and back between 1850 and early 1853. But it's unlikely because of the distance and the difficulty of the journey. There were groups that left Alabama and Tennessee to travel to California during the California Gold Rush, and there are lists of people who joined those companies. Duncan Stewart is not on any of those lists. Duncan would have had to have been back by the earliest of March of 1853 in order to father Amanda. So that leaves really a 2-year gap where we know that Duncan is not accounted for, but is it realistic that he traveled to California and back during that time? And I would say probably not, because it's just not enough time for him to have traveled there, looked for gold, and then come back. Also, Duncan's father dies in 1849, and he's the oldest male living at home. And I can't imagine that he would have left his aged mother and single sisters to take care of that property. I don't know exactly how much property they had, but I think it was significant, and significant enough that they couldn't have taken care of it by themselves. And so to answer the question, is it possible? Maybe, but unlikely. There are some remaining questions about Duncan Stewart. I really would like to be able to look at any will or probate, land records, etc., for Duncan Stewart's father to kind of get a better idea how much land they owned, whether Duncan Stewart was appointed to take care of the property. Also, his son John Duncan, it's not entirely clear that he really is Duncan Stewart's son, because John Duncan went by John Duncan Love and moved to Arkansas. And so why would he go by Love if he was the son of Duncan Stewart? I think there's some more history to kind of unravel there. Amanda Stewart does name Duncan Stewart as her father in records, and so we can pretty much accept that that is the situation there. But John Duncan Love, we don't know for sure. And I think, we've tied him to Elizabeth Pelt through DNA research, but not necessarily to Duncan Love. I think more needs to be done there. Anyway, that's the story of Duncan Stewart and what I've done, and I recommend taking a look at him because he is an interesting person, and I think that if he did leave, it was because of the scandal of fathering Amanda and John Duncan Love, that he had an affair with Elizabeth Pelt. But who knows? I could be wrong. But it's an interesting story, and the Alabama Road Books was one way I helped figure out whether he could have traveled. And again, the answer is probably not. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more case studies.